What if Integrated Biometrics could bring its fingerprint scanners to Apple's ecosystem? In this video, I want to present a conceptual feature request for Integrated Biometrics, especially the possibility of extending the IBScanUltimate SDK to support Apple's OS and macOS ecosystem. I'm using the KOJAK PL scanner as the main example because it is a very recognizable integrated biometrics device. But the idea I'm presenting is broader than KOJAK alone. The question is simple. Could existing integrated biometric scanners become part of Apple-based enterprise applications in the same way they can be integrated into other computing environments? And this idea doesn't come from simply asking what will be technically interesting. It comes from a real enterprise requirement. The situation involves a client that requires fingerprint biometrics, has already selected integrated biometrics hardware, and operates within an Apple environment. That combination creates an interesting integration question. The biometric hardware has already been selected, the requirement is already there, the Apple environment is already there. So the question becomes, how do we connect these three pieces together? That is, the scanner, the software development environment, and Apple's ecosystem. And this is where things become particularly interesting. The client had already selected integrated biometrics. So this isn't a case where we need to go back and choose a different biometric manufacturer. The hardware decision has already been made. The challenge is on the integration side. How do we take an integrated biometric scanner such as KOJAK and make it available to an application running within an Apple environment? That is the gap that this conceptual proposal is trying to address. Not replacing the biometric hardware, but extending the software integration possibilities around it. Before talking about what could be added, it is important to recognize what is already there. Integrated Biometrics already has an SDK ecosystem around its biometric hardware. And the IBScanUltimate SDK is the important piece here, because an SDK is what allows developers to build applications around the biometric device rather than communicating with the hardware from scratch. The existing ecosystem represented here spans platforms including Windows, Linux, Android, and Raspberry Pi. So the question I'm asking isn't, why doesn't Integrated Biometrics have an SDK? They already do. The question is whether Apple could become another part of that ecosystem. And this brings us to the actual feature request. What if we added Apple? Imagine an integrated biometric scanner connected to an iPhone or connected to a Mac with the biometric functionality exposed to an application through an official Apple-compatible SDK. For the developer, that could potentially mean that the biometric scanner becomes another input device available to an application running in the Apple environment. The developer wouldn't need to reinvent the biometric layer. Instead, the application could work through the Integrated Biometrics SDK. And that is where this idea becomes much more interesting than simply connecting a USB scanner to a computer. So what might the integration actually look like? At the hardware level, we have the KOJAK private license scanner. The scanner communicates through the integrated biometric software layer. Remember, the central component in this proposal is the IBScanUltimate SDK. The next layer will be support for Apple's operating system, that is the iOS and the macOS. And above that, the developer application. The application could then use the biometric capabilities provided through the SDK for whatever legitimate enterprise workflow the developer is building. And at the end of that chain, we have authentication. So conceptually, the architecture becomes biometric hardware, SDK, Apple platform, developer application, and finally, the authentication workflow. Again, this is a conceptual integration, not a claim that this particular Apple integration currently exists. Now, let's move from the technical integration to the enterprise opportunity. Apple devices are already deeply embedded in many professional and enterprise environments. If biometric hardware could be integrated into those environments through an official SDK, developers could potentially build biometric workflows around devices that organizations are already using. That could open possibilities across enterprise authentication, identity verification, access control workflows, secure applications, and other scenarios where fingerprint biometrics are appropriate. And more importantly, the value isn't simply the scanner by itself. The value comes from combining the biometric hardware, the operating system, the developer ecosystem, and the enterprise application. That is what turns hardware capability into an enterprise solution. So, could Apple be next? For integrated biometrics, I think there is an interesting opportunity here. KOJAK is already a compelling piece of biometric hardware, and the IBScanUltimate SDK provides the foundation for developers to build applications around integrated biometrics devices. Extending that developer opportunity into Apple's ecosystem could give developers another platform on which to build biometric applications. And for organizations that have already standardized on integrated biometrics hardware but operate in Apple environments, that could be a particularly interesting capability. So this video isn't announcing a new integrated biometrics product or claiming that this integration currently exists. It is simply a feature request. Could integrated biometrics bring KOJAK and potentially other IB scanners to iPhone and Mac? That's the question. And I will be very interested to see what Integrated Biometrics thinks about this.